Mr. President, I rise. Yesterday I came to the floor to oppose the cloture motion on the motion to proceed to the so-called Main Street Fairness Act. I, of course, like to, I think, properly name it the Internet Tax Collection Act, because that's what it is. I strongly oppose this bill, which has very serious flaws to it and very serious ramifications for not only businesses in my state, online businesses where we've seen great growth, but also online businesses across this nation. And I strongly disagree with the decision to fast-track this bill, to skip the regular markup process of the Finance Committee that both the chairman of the Finance Committee, Senator Baucus, and the ranking Republican on the Finance Committee, Senator Hatch, had opposed going to this bill without the committee doing its work. Why? There's a number of concerns that have been raised by this bill by members on both sides of the aisle. At a very minimum, we believe these concerns warrant a thorough vetting through the regular order. That's why I, along with Senators Wyden, Tester, Shaheen, Rubio, Lee, and Cruz, wrote a letter to the Majority Leader expressing these concerns, asking again for regular order for this bill. But here we are, cloture was invoked, and I suspect that the supporters of this bill certainly don't want to go through the markup process, so here we are again without regular order. This bill is wrong for a great area of growth for our country, which is online businesses, and small business owners get hit the worst under this bill. Small business owners from my state of New Hampshire have told me that this and large businesses from my state of New Hampshire that do business online have told me that this legislation would make it harder for them to do business. And during the recent Senate work period, I held 2 roundtable discussions in New Hampshire, one in Manchester and one in Portsmouth. It was a great opportunity to hear directly from the ground of what the implications of this bill will be to business owners in my state. And I'd like to share with you a sampling of the feedback from businesses in New Hampshire about this bill. Russ Gateskill, he is the president and CEO of Garnet Hill in Franconia, New Hampshire. It's going to be an administrative nightmare. Other feedback we've gotten. He sent to my office an example of what he would have to do. Now understand what this will make online businesses have to do in this country. They now become the tax collectors for other states, even though they don't rely on the services in those states, they don't use the roads in those states, they don't get to vote for the representatives in those states. Taxation without representation. That's what this bill is about. And they now have to collect for the rest of the nation almost 9,600 tax jurisdictions of different, not only state sales taxes, but local and county sales taxes. I just want to use one example of what this is like and what an administrative nightmare this is for businesses. This is one page on a 40-page sales tax manual from the state of Illinois, and this is what one of our businesses or any online business across the nation is going to face. In New Hampshire, if Russ Gateskill, if there is a customer from Illinois who chooses to buy from Russ's online business that's in New Hampshire, here we are. So if he has to collect, if the person lives in Grand Prairie, it's a 6.5% rate. But if the person lives in the Lake in the Hills in Illinois, it's a 7.75% rate. Or perhaps from Kelowna, which is again, or it's Collison, a 6.5% rate. Or if you're in Dow, it's a 7% rate. 9,600 different tax jurisdictions across this nation. And the people who are pushing this bill, the proponents of it, say, oh, no problem for these businesses. Just use software. Every business just has this software. It's going to be easy as pie. Really? So when Dow changes their tax rate 0.5%, the whole program changes. And yes, that burden's put on the business. Talk about an administrative nightmare. And you know why? Because states are in a position where they want to use this as a cash grab to make other states and online businesses do their work of tax collecting for them instead of them doing it themselves. And I can't believe that my colleagues are going to go along with this and those who are pushing it. I think it's especially odd that there are Republicans who want to create this kind of complicated tax mess. And I hear from my colleagues on this side of the aisle all the time about how we're going to cut through regulations, we're going to make it easier for businesses. And a lot of my colleagues on the Republican end here are pushing this notion that a business, just let them purchase some software and then let them try to collect for almost 9,600 tax jurisdictions in the nation, and what could possibly go wrong for an online business? Many of them who are smaller businesses in this country, trying to thrive, trying to grow during a difficult economy. I also heard from E&R Laundry and Cleaners, a small business based in Manchester that was founded in 1921. About 70% of E&R's sales is now internet-based. And the company's president said he wouldn't have the resources to calculate, collect, and deliver sales taxes for thousands of jurisdictions across the country. A bakery in my hometown of Nashua echoed that sentiment. Susan Lozier-Robert of Frederick's Pastries, and anyone who's been to Frederick's Pastries, yum. I can understand why people across the country would want to get some Frederick's Pastries, but it would create a mass, what Susan said, it would create mass confusion keeping up with all the individual state tax codes. I've heard the same from one of the state's most prominent maple sugar producers in New Hampshire. We're a state that prides itself on its maple sugar products. Peter Thompson, his father was the late Governor Mel Thompson, a wonderful figure in our state's history. So he said that the legislation under consideration would be a burden we just couldn't afford. Ken Smith, the owner of Mainly, New Hampshire, said, I physically don't have the manpower or the hours to handle something like this. And Jen Coffey, another business owner, said, if I had to become a tax collector on top of what I've already trying to do as a startup, we know how hard it is to start your own business, by the way. She said, I'd be out of business. I've also heard widespread concerns about the threat from faraway audits that this legislation would bring. So that poster board I just had up there with all those tax rates, in every single one of those jurisdictions, so if you divide it by county or you divide it by state, when a business in another state, in New Hampshire, for example, they're selling to a customer in Illinois, they can then, if their computer program that everyone's saying is so easy doesn't calculate it right, they can be hauled in for an audit in another state where they don't have any physical presence. And what do they do? They got to get a lawyer in another state. They got to deal in a court system in another state or with auditors, with the Department of Revenue who do they deal with? So talk about administrative nightmare to be dragged into other states for potential audits, to have to hire lawyers in other states. I mean, what an administrative mess that this bill will create. And, it's really shocking to think that, that people actually want to say that this somehow is going to level the playing field or make it fairer when it puts this great burden on businesses. Travis Adams with Wadi.com, based in Nashua, said one tax audit from another state or jurisdiction would completely crush us. Ben Baker, an online retailer in Barrington, said small businesses like mine just can't handle that sort of accounting burden. If I have to hire a bookkeeper or pay my current off-site accountant significantly more per month to track all this, you can bet my plans to expand the business in the next 6 months is a lot less likely. Paul Ford, online retailer in Portsmouth, perhaps summed it up best when he said, the last thing we need is legislation like this. I'd also like to mention a comment from Joel Malloy, a friend of mine. He's a great business owner in New Hampshire, president of Polaris Direct, and he said, this isn't about making Main Street more competitive, it's about passing new taxes onto consumers. And that's consistent with other business owners have told me from across New Hampshire, and certainly I've also heard it from businesses across the nation, because they know this isn't about competitiveness, It's about helping states get more money to spend on programs that they can't afford. And that's what the Wall Street Journal said this week. The paper called the Marketplace Fairness Act an online revenue raid. They said, this is a bill, of course, you know who's pushing this bill? Big business, big retail business. And you know what it does, according to the Wall Street Journal, and I fully agree with them on this, big business and big government are uniting to pursue their mutual interest in sticking it to the little guy. Big business and big government pursuing their mutual interest to stick it to the little guy. Haven't we had enough of that in our nation? The paper concluded that the new revenues will merely fund larger government. So some of my conservative colleagues have tried to justify their support for this big government bill on the notion that their states will be able to reduce their income or sales tax. I think we all understand that there's no requirement in this bill that states have to reduce some other tax burden if they collect taxes in this way. This is just about spending more money. And let's talk about the Constitution here. By imposing collection requirements on businesses that have no physical presence outside their home state, I also fear that this is going to really trample on existing state sovereignty. Under current Supreme Court precedent, in the absence of an actual sufficient nexus, a state cannot reach beyond its borders to compel out-of-state internet vendors to collect taxes on a particular transaction, and that's the Quill decision. By usurping and changing this standard, it would undermine an important limitation in the Commerce Clause, the nexus requirement. So now your nexus with a state is a click. A click. A click on your mouse makes you have to collect for somebody else's, so you've got to be collected on instead of a physical presence in a state. And if an online business in New Hampshire has to collect and remit sales taxes for online customers from Massachusetts, what's to prevent Congress from later expanding the Commerce Clause even further to require New Hampshire brick and mortar businesses to collect the Massachusetts tax? Because Massachusetts has already tried to do this to New Hampshire. In fact, when I was Attorney General of the state, we brought a case to the Massachusetts Supreme Court because there were customers from Massachusetts that came over to buy some tires in New Hampshire, and the Mass DRA tried to get New Hampshire businesses to collect that tax. Well, that's exactly what we're doing with this bill. And it actually places an unfair burden on online businesses versus brick and mortar businesses that are in that situation who now do not have to collect that. But I worry that will be the next step for businesses in my state of New Hampshire and other states across this nation that do not have a sales tax. And what about stores that sell through catalogs? Their customers are frequently older and less likely to have transportation or be online. Will catalog vendors also start having to collect and remit state sales taxes? And finally, what about other unintended consequences on consumers, retirees, and investors? That's the type of information we would have talked about in a committee hearing that we didn't have on this bill before the Finance Committee. There was a hearing, but there was no markup. And a markup is when you try to improve and deal with unintended consequences to a bill. Could this bill open the door to taxes on financial services or transaction taxes? Some of the financial organizations have raised that issue. And in my home state of New Hampshire, it's a matter of pride that we do not have a sales tax. And this bill tramples on that choice for the state of New Hampshire. That's because we know that it gives our retailers, yes, an advantage in a competitive marketplace. But we also know that low taxes are the result of low spending. But this legislation threatens to trample on retailers in all states, forcing them to become tax collectors for other states, nearly 9,600 tax jurisdictions, as I've mentioned. I said it before and I'll say it again. This truly is taxation without representation, because businesses in New Hampshire or online businesses in other states can now be subject to doing the business of governments in other states of collecting their taxes where they don't elect the representatives there, where they don't rely on the the roads there or the services there. And here we have it, the ultimate in taxation without representation. And I would say to my conservative colleagues, why would you want to support such authority given by the federal government? Supporters of this amendment argue they've created an exemption for small businesses of $1 million for small sellers. But this amount is not indexed to anything. And what about the business that's $1.1 million in sales? Then they have to do it, and it's going to discourage businesses from growing. And also, this limit is far lower than the SBA, the Small Business Administration, actually defines a small business. And even with this exemption, trust me, once this exemption is in place and the states don't get all the revenue that they want, they'll be back. They will be back before this body to say, we didn't get enough money, so you need to authorize us further. Get rid of the exemption. We have a right to collect from those businesses as well, or have them collect for us as well, because that's what it is, requiring them to collect for us. Mr. President, there's a broad coalition of groups that are opposed to this far-reaching legislation. Let me talk about a few of them. Number one, Americans for Tax Reform. Americans for Tax Reform has said this legislation grants states new tax collection authority without removing equivalent taxing authority elsewhere. Therefore, this legislation can only be viewed as a tax increase. A tax increase. The Financial Services Roundtable has said this legislation has the potential for unintended consequences. It's important for Congress to explore all possible outcomes and costs of this proposal, especially the impact on consumers. A transaction tax on financial service products will hurt retail investors, retired Americans, and small businesses, effectively making it more expensive for them to invest and plan for the long term. And without hearings, these implications and others will not be properly addressed. Again, the Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association has raised similar concerns, saying that this could lead to a financial transaction tax which will hurt all of us. TechNet opposes this, saying imposing a new internet sales tax regime is a tremendously complex issue that should be addressed through regular order, starting in the Senate Finance Committee and done through a thorough and deliberative manner, which has not been done here. We should not rush a proposal that is riddled with holes and, most importantly, does not provide enough protections for small businesses, the backbone of our economy. Americans for Prosperity opposes this. Americans for Prosperity says this bill will not level the playing field. It would burden online retailers in a way that brick and mortar stores are not. Complying with the internet sales tax would be a considerable administrative burden for companies, particularly for small businesses. FreedomWorks opposes this as well. Heritage Action for America opposes this. There are many. National Taxpayer Union opposes this. The Competitive Enterprise Union opposes this. Competitive Enterprise Institute has the Council for Citizens Against Government Waste. These are groups that are committed to low taxes, less government, and free enterprise so that we can have a strong economy. And again, I would encourage my colleagues from both sides of the aisle, especially my colleagues on this side of the aisle, to listen to the red flags that these groups and several of my other colleagues have raised. Mr. President, I will conclude by once again restating the serious concerns I have about this legislation. Concerns about the impact on small business owners in my state and in states across the nation. Concerns about the impact on online businesses that have been such an area of growth for this country. And when have we put the tax collecting burden on businesses in this country that should be done by the states themselves? The concerns about the administrative application of this bill, I showed you all the tax jurisdictions. To put that burden on businesses is absolutely wrong. Wrong for creating jobs in this country, and it is absolutely wrong to put such an administrative burden on people that are working so hard in starting their business and thriving and making sure that they grow. I believe we are opening Pandora's box with this bill, and this shouldn't be done in the manner it has been without regular order. We are talking about a massive reorganization on how sales tax are collected in this country, and what will be next? What will the states ask us for authority to tax next? I think that should be a very big question for our colleagues here. I strongly encourage my colleagues to put the brakes on this bill and to think about the harm this legislation would do to small online retailers across America. And when consumers and online retailers in your states find out what's actually in this bill, and they don't understand why their senators would support an online sales tax bill, I know that they'll raise many concerns to you when they have the administrative burden and the nightmare of trying to collect for 9,600 tax jurisdictions in this nation. Mr. President, I would urge my colleagues to oppose this bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.